Okay, let's jump right back in. And so, before we go into this next portion, we have 2 hours left. 2 hours. Wow. We've gone on such a journey together. Um, Before we go into it, this next part really talks about the overlap and the considerations we have to take into consideration with a substance use related death, the stigma that impacts it, and the unique nuances that we have to be aware of, not only that affect the supportive resources that we give families, but what they might be contending with that's internalized and in community as an understanding of their loss. But before we go into that, I want to open it up with another documentary or short clip from Speaking Grief. This is Norma Purdue who tells her story about when her son died from a drug overdose and what she talks about as far as her grief experience.
My son, I really had no idea how heavy grief is. It's heavy. In the beginning, it was so brutal. It was hard just to function. Losing someone to an overdose colors your grief in the way of you have this extra baggage that you carry. The three words that come to my mind are judgment, stigma, and guilt. When someone dies of cancer, which is also a disease, we don't have those same associations. The stigma that's associated with addiction and the guilt that I felt as a parent, not being able to help him, right? Feeling that I could have done more. So there's that added baggage that you carry around. When good things happen in your life, they don't necessarily cancel out something else that has happened. We've had a really joyful event in our lives because my daughter has a new baby and she carries Drew's name as her middle name. The baby and that joy is healing in some way. However, joy like that really cracks your heart open and you feel the grief even more. It's like the more joy you can hold, the more grief you can hold too. Although I still grieve my losses, I will say that the weight has lightened. For me, what has made it easier is getting to a place where I know that I still have a relationship with my son. I believe that nothing can separate us. Death can't separate us. Drew is in God. God is in Drew. I am in God. God is in me. Drew and I are together. And I think that we are eternally connected. I just wish he was here.
Thank you, Ambrosia. And so Nona shares in her story how it colored her grief differently, right? We heard the word stigma, shame, judgment. And as we've gone through what we've seen that's internalized, but also what's in our social understanding, we've been able to now pinpoint how that can impact not only someone seeking support when they are active in substance use disorder, but what that looks like for the people who are grieving someone who's died from substance use. And so, if we take a step into that direction, what are those particular nuances that we have to be aware of that not only help us understand that when we enter this world with families, even if we have similarities, we still enter as learners. I was at a recent place and they're like, oh yeah, that there's some experts here. And I really have a hard time when anyone uses and utilizes that language because what that assumes, it disempowers the person in front of me and it says that I hold something that they don't. And really, what I like to do is give that back because I don't have their story. I know my losses and I'm an expert in my particular losses, but everyone is an expert in what they're going through, right? They can only tell us what it feels and looks like from their perspective. The same is true for within a family with children. A child's perspective is different from the adult's perspective. What I have is some education and framework that helps inform us and then what dismantles what we know on a cultural level that might tell us we're doing something wrong. And then if something is maladaptive, where we can find those additional resources. So what are the things that we need to be mindful when supporting substance use related death? So what grief in substance use loss actually looks like is a lot of times we don't recognize what happened before the death. When we look at a normal quote, quote, a normal grief timeline, we talk about the death and the grieving process after. But for families impacted by a substance use disorder, the grief and loss process, like how we talked about yesterday, has started actually before the death. It's life with the substance use disorder. And to recognize that life with a substance use disorder has been following these particular set of rules. Remember Claudia Black's rules? They don't talk about it, they can't trust their environment, and it's not safe to feel. And so, if these are the rules that have been navigating their survival with substance use disorder present, then we have to take into consideration that that changes the grief experience after death. Meaning, if you hold grief groups or you have groups where kids come together, peer groups or adult groups that are talking about after their person died, they are following these particular set of rules into that grief support room. Meaning, even if you have the right conditions that make it therapeutically safe, that might not be comfortable yet to someone who's impacted by this ambiguous loss, which we'll go into more later. But in substance use loss, it's important to recognize the forms of loss that are often unrecognized. It's also called disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief talks about things that people can grieve. They're not culturally or socially normal. They're not made normal or aware or permitted as grief on a social level, right? And so we have to recognize that there is a loss of expression. It's not always safe to talk about their person. There is a loss of expressions for fear of judgment. There's a loss of expression because it might not have been safe to feel those feelings. There's a loss in an identity if we think about the lost child, even recognizing maybe not being able to be validated in their experiences. There's the loss of safety, which was shown yesterday. It was elevated to the forefront of what it might look like to have a loss of sense of safety or to have a misconstrued sense of what safety was. There's the loss of trust, which is attached to safety, and the loss of childhood. So when we think of childhood, many times when there's also the multi-generational factor, there is almost perpetuated that childhood ended early, right, for families impacted by substance use disorder. And to recognize that this presence of substance use increases those adverse childhood experience and the likelihood of adverse childhood experiences. And so additional losses might be loss of home, whether their person was removed from the home through incarceration or just restraining orders, all the different ways it can look like, or if the child was removed from their environment. And then to recognize that's also a loss of roles. And so, one way we can look at the role as a child might understand their identity in that system, even if it's dysfunctional. But then when they get removed from their home, now they have a whole new identity they have to wrestle with, and routines and transitions they have to navigate. Similarly, with the grandparent, they've lost their role of being the grandparent. They've lost their capability of being present in a grandparent role because they're stepping back into the parent role. And so, how can we be mindful? And that goes to many times. Sometimes we have older siblings raising younger siblings who are taking on that role, right? The loss of predictability. And for families impacted by substance use, there might have been an ongoing loss that has been there since before the death. And to recognize that stigma is already impacting the grief process. The stigma that was there when their person was alive and trapped by substance use disorder is already internalized at play when the death occurs now. So, what do we have to be in consideration? And what is it to navigate that type of loss? So, before we go into what ambiguous loss is in those intersections, I wanted to take a moment because I told you I would about now understanding the difference between grief informed and trauma informed. Because what tends to happen is these two get blended, and it's the belief is that if you're trauma informed, you're grief informed, and vice versa. And there's a lot of overlap, but it's really important to make a distinction between the two. So, grief informed, what we shared, is a natural response to loss, which means if it's a natural response to loss, we can also recognize it's still a disruptive process, right? But it is part of the human experience, and humans have an innate capacity to adapt. What's important to recognize by being grief informed, this is a very non pathologizing approach, meaning we do not look at grief responses or reactions as symptoms, right? We're not trying to create a diagnosis in their grief. Grief is okay. These are the ways your bodies are going through changes after loss. If you even think from a leadership structural perspective, a lot of things around change management, adaptive leadership, adaptive parenting pull in these components to navigating change, right? Trauma informed, though, recognizes there was a maladaptive response or coping to an unnaturally disruptive response or process, right? Like those adverse childhood experience and domestic violence, substance use or misuse, potential abuse and neglect, bullying, natural disasters. Those are not natural types of grieving process like a death, right? Those are complicated by certain other additional factors, but it also is the absence of being able to have self-efficacy, healthy coping that can make something traumatic. So the reason we bring both of these folds in is because you might start to recognize, and if you can look at this across even sibling experience, some child might have experience and it might be more traumatic, while the other child does not have a traumatic response based on their self-efficacy, coping skills, ability to talk, communication, their perception of a support system. So even the same loss can elicit different needs within the family. Where it overlaps is something that's typically stigmatic loss like substance use. We start to see a little bit more integration of where those two overlap. Both processes search for context, right? We look for grief layers. We also ask questions to what happened. We look at past experiences, other additional adverse childhood experiences, and what that looks like. Each person dictates their individual needs, right? Again, that's trauma informed, that's grief informed. And then both of them look at that whole body experience, right? What is it? How is it affecting the body? How is it affecting the cognitive, emotional, development, social emotional, those intersections? So if we look at it from this perspective, we can see how grief informed overlaps in certain instances, but it's not doesn't necessarily mean being trauma informed. We're not treating all grief like trauma. And so I think this distinction is very helpful when we're trying to figure out needs, because what this tells us is that there's multiple needs, right? So if a family has a loss, sometimes I've had it where a death has occurred and the immediacy was, okay, get them therapy. Well, let's evaluate this child and what they have in their family, their resources. Are they talking about it with people? Are they connecting? Do they have outlets? Is there opportunities? What are the additional needs for that child? And sometimes the family naturally has it because they are grief informed. Sometimes they need additional support. So it's important to look at the intersection to really understand that that means each one has a different option and how can we incorporate that. Another reason I bring this in is because there's a lot going on and there's a lot of actual internal challenging and conflict, which is good. We want that in the field where some are happy that certain things are in the DSM now, such as complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, and some are not happy with it. And part of the reason it was put into the DSM was to increase access to support resources and services so that this part of care can be taken care of and ensured and properly recognized. What we wanted to be careful, and the other argument is that we have to be careful that we're not pathologizing grief in itself, because some of the criteria that's in that prolonged grief disorder kind of still falls into the grief process if we're recognizing this is ongoing and lifelong. So I'm just going to give that as a debate, just
Hello.
oh, okay. As a debate, as to just to take into feedback. But it's something that as a field we talk about quite often about how those two can interact. So ambiguous loss, as we filter back into this idea of how this particular part impacts those in processes. It says ambiguous loss has three different ways it can present itself with families. And you'll notice that this is applicable to not just substance use disorder, but other forms of loss like dementia, Alzheimer, maybe a family that's been in change in identity, these particular things. So ambiguous loss, it can look like loved ones who are physically absent are often kept psychologically present. So even though they're not there, it's the preoccupation of where are they? It is, I don't know where my dad is. He left 3 days ago, but I'm missing him every day. It's the preoccupation children have, even though that they know that their person is somewhere out in the world, that they are still thinking about them. There's a loss there. It's loved ones who are physically present, but psychologically absent from who they're expected to be. So we can think about how drugs and alcohol might change behaviors in our person, even though they're in front of us, right? So it might look like mom has been sleeping for a few days now, and I miss when she would play with us. She's been very different lately. Or it might look like my brother, once he started hanging out, with different people, he started looking different. And that actually goes into our next one here, which loved ones who are physically present but have had an identity change aren't, and they are expected to be as they always were. So this actually presents itself sometimes as a challenge for people who find recovery, right? The idea is once someone finds recovery, everything's going to get better. But often in that recovery process, the family is now all navigating new changes in behavior in their person's behaviors are different, their treatment plan has on something that is completely unfamiliar. Everything is changing. So this is something that we've seen not only with people in recovery, maybe if people change spiritual faiths and beliefs, it could be also applied when people might be having an identity change. So all of these things can create that it's not presenting as it normally would be. So that could be like your brother now hanging out with a new crowd and now he's acting completely different. Again, example, someone finds sobriety and they're completely different. I don't know who this person is anymore. So to recognize that this can be a play also, and that they have been dealing with an ambiguous loss before their person had died, which also can sometimes manifest as anticipatory loss, which we'll get into later. So feelings for children and families after a substance use related death. Again, this is not exhaustive, but it's the ones that I want to anchor with because they're the ones that tend to need more nurturing, understanding, and space because they're often stigmatized, right? There's shame and the guilt that we talked about in the previous day, anger, rejection, or sometimes it looks like abandonment, resentment towards their person, numb, shock, or apathy, right? Ambivalence towards their person who died. So even there might be not only they had hard and difficult feelings or heavy emotions around the person who died, there might even be relief, that their person's not there anymore. They actually might feel like they're finally safe now that their person has died. And so recognizing ambivalence can sometimes create additional feelings of tension, like guilt over those feelings. And so, what does it mean to hold space for all of those feelings as they navigate? And then recognizing the anticipatory loss, right? From the previous day, we saw a child who was talking in that quote that they feel like they're mourning their person every day, right? And so that talks a little bit more to the anticipatory grief process when they are waiting for something to happen and how that interplays once the death and if the death occurs. And so when this is at play, it reinforces stigma. And remember, if we think that stigma is ultimate impact is shame, and shame decreases help-seeking behavior, means shame keeps the silence in play. And how it can look like is recognizing that children who have had someone die from a stigmatic loss, but specifically substance use disorder, they might have partial sharing or lie about their person. I have a dear friend whose eldest son died from substance use disorder. And she talks about it. She goes, I have to read the room with the people who are there. And based on how they're already acting, if they ask me, do you have any kids? I have to assess, like, do I just say I have three and I don't talk about it? Do I say he would have been 30? Or do I say he is 30 so they don't know that he's died? Because I don't know if I can tell them the truth around that person, right? So she's trying to navigate by reading in the room. Is it safe to tell the full truth? Or do I have to take a partial truth? Or do I have to lie, which impacts their ability to tell their story, which is supportive to the grieving process. Rituals and memorials are changed or reduced. So, in several studies, it was shown that families that were impacted by a substance use related loss, there was a dynamic that happened twofold. One, that if it happened within their family, they were protective of who could come to that service, right? Because they were fear of judgment from the outside world of how their person has died. And so, in order that they kept it closer, smaller, or they didn't have a service. On the flip side of that, people who are connected to that person are blocked from the ritual and memorial that is a natural part of that shared experience when someone has died. I have been on both ends of that, where I have had a friend die, and when we wanted to go see him, we could not because his was tied to substance use and suicide, and we were removed. And so we felt so disconnected from that process, though it was the family from the inside not wanting the judgment from other people, their intrusive questions, and what that looked like. But to recognize when there's a reduction in rituals and memorials, that can impact a process that is actually naturally supportive to the grief process, which in turn dehumanizes their person. It's that feeling of less than. Is my grief valid? Is my person valid? Or because of these internalized stigma, has it changed? So creates a feeling of a less right to grieve. And some of that comes from the idea that when people are showing up, the fixation is on how the person died or the substance use and not their person, right? So sometimes there becomes a fixation on the end of life instead of honoring the life and the person that was before they died. And all of these decrease that access to support. So we had someone share about this, and I'll share it on the next slide. But how it could sound like for stigma when it's impacted by substance use is when people say, at least their struggle is over. They brought this on themselves. Well, they made their choice, right? Or I saw it coming. Again, we start to see that moral failure slipping back through the cracks and impacting how we're sharing or how we're showing up for those people. And so other considerations we have to think about is what those intrusive questions do from others and how that might increase their or decrease their help seeking behavior and increase shame. To recognize there might be a lack of information, right? If someone dies from a substance use disorder, they might have toxicology reports. There might be lack of information based on how or where they were found. And so they are still dealing with the ambiguity of lack of answers. And therefore, when people ask questions, people might be asking questions that they're still trying to navigate and process. They don't have them either. And that impacts the grief process afterwards. And legal considerations, just because of the nature of drugs and alcohol and how it's um, the criminalization and everything around it and what those components are, there might be legal reasons why they cannot share. There might be ongoing investigations that have them bound to their story. So even if they want to share what's going on for their own internal needs, they actually might not be able to based on what that might be incorporated or integrated with. It's not always, but it's definitely a consideration to think about. And sometimes in legal consideration, it's even recognizing that it might be public, right? People might know about this that normally wouldn't know about this. And so what does that also take into consideration of where those intrusive questions are coming from? And so a participant of a substance use, adult child of substance use disorder shared this. And she shared, my mom was alive for 42 years, and for someone to judge her on the last thing she did is not fair. She caused me a tremendous amount of pain, but she was not a coward. She was not selfish. And so this was in response to most of her support system staying focused not only on how she died, but also the disease that they saw as the moral failure. And she was able in this space to really hold, it's like called dialectical thinking, which we'll talk about later, but she was able to hold the both and of her experience. That yes, she caused me pain, but that is not all she is, and that's not the only focus of her life. And so, what can we do? What can we do to stay child led and create opportunities to change the conversation with the children and families we're supporting? First is to humanize the person who died. You've heard me say this already. Say their name. Ask for them to share memories of their person that include stories beyond the lost timeline if they have it. Sometimes it's also allowing them to tell the story about how when they were trapped by drugs and alcohol, what that process was even too, but allowing that conversation to be fluid. I've been in groups sometimes where children are like, I like to share the stories about when I could laugh with my dad. But then someone in group will say, but wasn't he an addict? And they quantify it that just because he was that way, that only my memories could possibly be bad. And so to recognize that we have to stay present with kids and keep humanizing their person, validate a child's emotions, thoughts, and feelings. And so for caregivers, particularly with this, I take some time to recognize because sometimes if the language is not there, validating can feel like you're agreeing. And that's not necessarily what we're saying, right? Because a parent will come up to me and say, I don't want to agree with my child that they should feel guilty. They shouldn't feel guilty. This isn't their fault. Validation is not the same as agreeing, and taking the time to walk with parents through understanding that helps them change in their ability to validate, right? And so if a child is sharing about how they had guilt that they fought with their sister before she left and never came home, you simply validating sounds like, wow, I'm hearing you share about the guilt before your sister died. That's validating. It's not agreeing. I didn't say you should feel guilty about that or I agree on the guilt, but you're validating that you recognize that it's a feeling and emotion that's present in that child. And then there's an opportunity for them to process, share about that. And we'll talk about how you can use open-ended questions to help them tell story to maybe create a place where they can actually challenge that guilt through and over time. But it's not our job to take away, but we're also through validation not agreeing. Listen actively and without judgment. And so this is again where we reflect, in our face and being aware of our own responses. Am I, when they share about how their person died, am I reacting? Am my eyes getting bigger? Did my mouth drop? Did I withdraw? Did I show body language that I'm uncomfortable with their person and how they died? So how are not we only listening with our ears, but also how are we listening and showing we're present with our body? Stay focused on their feelings and not the details. So if we stay with them on where they're going in their emotional process, then we keep from turning our curiosity into curiosity for ourselves. Well, I want to know how that person died. I'm curious what was the substance. I'm curious if that's not what they're needing to share based on what they're feeling, that's not where you need to go. And so this actually helps dismantle the idea that you have to have all the details in order to support someone grieving, right? You don't need all the details. You can stay with them where they're at based on what their needs are in that moment. And if you notice, follow up and connect with additional resources. What does that follow up look like? And how can you be super intentional about ensuring that follow up happens? Right. So, um, oftentimes I created a document for some counselors where if they check in with a student and you say, hey, I see that Mother's Day is coming up. I'm going to come and pull you from class maybe and just check and see how you are. Is that okay? Yes. Have it documented, write it somewhere where you know that you're going to follow through with that follow up because they're also paying attention as well. So, what does it mean to support that ambiguous loss, right? Because that ambiguity carries into their process when they're grieving the death. And these are the five components you can build in. I'm going to focus in on one, but to recognize if you have opportunity, Bowlby's work on attachments. Has that caused them? And if you look at the roles of survival, you can kind of see how that might overlap. Are they someone who's become anxious in their attachment, maybe avoidant? What does that tell you that needs to be nurtured within those components? Build and accept tolerance for the unknown. Predictability has been something that might be foreign to these families. So there could be hypervigilant, that toxic stress response. So, how are we building that tolerance for the unknown? Finding meaning. And we'll go into that deeper because I think this is where all of a sudden we have to be careful we're not turning this into fix it language, right? The everything happens for a reason. That's not what this actually means. And we'll go into that in a little bit. And it's tied into how we actually build hope in the face of adversity and then reconstructing their identity. So part of this is building agency. What is one of the core things that you can do with people who are dealing and navigating ambiguous loss? It's building that agency. This is not only grief informed, it's really supportive to trauma. When maladaptive practices and coping environment has been impacted, having that internal locus of control is helpful to know what their options are between and what they can control and what they can do. So the internal part of that, the roots that we'll talk about is how can we help children and families recognize their gifts? What are the things that they're really good at? Are they really good listeners? Are they a good big brother or sister? Do they help out? Are they great at art? Are they a gifted speaker? Are they, an avid reader? So think of the tangible and intangible gifts and how can you elevate that within themselves to help build that self-efficacy? Work on goal setting. And goal setting has micro and macro pieces, right? Or what are the things that you want to do to get through school, or the things that you want to get through in a day, or the things that are important to you. And if they bring a big goal, how can you make several small achievable steps so it sets them up for success, right? What are those achievable steps? Breaking down big goals. We see that in education, we see that in coaching, we see it in all those capacities, but how can we help them have a goal setting? And then helping them recognize what is important to them. What are the internal values that guide them? So we saw this a little bit in building differentiation of self, right? So what are the values that they can build within the self? Well, because of how everything happened, I can't stand when people lie to me. So honesty is something that I do. Okay, tell us how it looks like when people are being honest to you and what you expect. And also, can you share how you lead from a place of honesty? Helping create a stronger connection with their values is helping on the formation also of their identity. And then from the part that reach out is looking more towards how they build their social capital. In those gifts and in that goal setting, are there mentors that they can have? Whether it's an athletic director or a coach, or maybe someone academic, a counselor in college setting. Who are those mentors that can help formulate? This is where we actually see a lot of peer support, right? people who've gone through what they've gone through and are doing something different or in a different space, right? Someone who can relate, but also is aligned with either particular gifts or shared experience. Helping understand who their support system is. A lot of times, kids particularly feel like my support systems are friends and family, and that's it. But how can we make that more dynamic for them by recognizing educator, coaches, communities, areas, neighborhoods, all the different ways support systems can look? But not only helping them recognize their support system, how they might utilize it, right? I was at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I was one of the moderators and facilitators for a room, and we had a speaker, and she was a teen, and she talked about how she had her person that when she needed to laugh and just forget about it. She had a different person for when she needed to cry, another person for when she wanted to just let someone else be in charge and let take over. And it was a safe adult that she could go to. And she talked about how another person was her person who would, when she actually wanted advice, that's who she would go to because they know that they would do it. So it didn't have to be one person, but it actually was this dynamic of a bunch of people. And she was able to recognize based on what I need, I know who I might call. And what that leads to is confidence and advocacy and activating and utilizing their support system. So many times when I would do group, we would talk about all the different people in their life. But then when I would ask them, well, who do you talk to? They're like, oh, no one. So even though they've identified people through conversation, yet they didn't have a stronger connection with who they talked to when they needed it. How can we strengthen that and help and support them make those connections so they can advocate for themselves when their needs and their person needs it? And so growing stronger together is a particularly one that the blend there that was talking about hope and meaning. And this is commonly referred to as post-traumatic growth. And what post-traumatic growth refers to is the positive changes that can happen after experiencing a difficult or traumatic event. And the process of finding new strength, meaning hope, is after a hardship, right? But what this isn't saying again is that cliche of everything happens for a reason. It is more saying something we didn't want to happen has happened. And what are we doing as we move forward? So we want to be careful we're not using this framework to minimize their experience, but to recognize that finding meaning is an ongoing process. What's important to know as helpers, both as a parent and as practitioners, we cannot assign that meaning for them. If we see them going through something and we see a connection that this will make you a fill in the blank person, stronger person, a this person, we're giving the meaning we think it might be, which might not be the road that they're leaning down. In my own losses, when I remember when I had my miscarriage, everyone thought like, oh, you're going to work with moms who have had serious miscarriages the same way you have. And they kept trying to force me like, because you work in grief and loss, this is where you're supposed to go. And I was like, you know what? I think that's mine. I don't think that's where I need to go. And so to recognize, even though we might see opportunities for that meaning, the meaning has to come from them. You create space and tools and art ways that they can explore that meaning. Because two children, how often end up in two different completely areas because they reach that place in different capacities based on their temperament, who they were, their role, and how that evolves in their development. And so to recognize if that's true, this is more of a way for people to understand their resiliency, how they navigate hardships, how to connect with others, that restoration process, and appreciate life in new ways. Not appreciate that their person died or appreciate that something happened that didn't happen, but how can we help them reconnect with different ways in their life that build gratitude that doesn't minimize their experience? And so this is done through helping new skills in coping and connection. So we'll actually go into the next page of what that looks like. And so three easy ways to help foster the space for them to explore that meaning, not assign the meaning, is foster open communication. So what can you do around creating space for them to talk about the challenges, sometimes even when it's difficult, without trying to rescue them from the difficult pieces? practice gratitude and connection. I like to expand if you can try and practice gratitude without saying thankful all the time, right? Because then they kind of assigns that like, well, what do you have to be thankful for? And you're like, okay, stop trying to force me out of this space. But more so, what about today was a good thing? You know what? Like I've done it where I've celebrated the fact that, whew, after that, I got out of bed and I actually like cleaned my room. You know, like the room is clean and that helps me in a space, but that's all I was able to do today. It might even be smaller than that. So, how are we meeting kids where they're out to practice gratitude and recognize gratitude can be very small wins, and they're still important wins. And that creates deeper connections. And then promote meaning making tools, strategies. And so, how are we do that without us assigning it? We do it because so many times families afterwards, right? How many times? Why me? Why did this happen? What happens now? Here's that ambiguity, right? And so we help create the space for that by letting them tell their story, right? If families are impacted by stigmatic loss, don't actually have opportunity to tell their story as often, this is why it's so important for PTG, post-traumatic growth. How can we allow them to tell their story? Because every time they tell their story, they can story craft, right? In that role play, we talked about how sometimes I died and sometimes I lived when I was in a play with a child. Michael shared even the play and expression, the therapeutic play and the dramatic play, how that can sometimes the story shifts and is fluid and in and out. They are have an opportunity to craft their story. Have you ever told a story about something that's happened to you 15 times and on the 16th time, all of a sudden you told the story and you found some new information that shifted your perspective? I never thought about it that way, right? So if people and children are allowed to tell their story, they can start crafting their story as their development happens and as they grow, that integral piece, right? Reinvest in life goals. This is where they have an opportunity to, again, do those goal setting projects, and it creates a way where they explore their identity after loss. So again, meaning making, while this sounds like it's only a therapeutic way, this can all be done through play, through natural ways that we do it. Some people do it for writing. Um, I have a friend who she disappears for 2 weeks and is somewhere out in the world and she comes back, and that's her meaning making process where she uproots herself from where she's at and sees and does something new with a whole completely different culture. I love that for her. But meaning making can look a lot of different ways. And so to recognize as we're talking about ambiguous loss and ambivalent loss, where there might be difficult challenges or feelings around how their person dies or the relationship they had with their person or anticipatory loss, something that's helpful is to understand dialectical thinking and how this is helpful to create a more flexible mindset and cognitive flexibility for families so that they know things can look different and change, right? So dialectical thinking is living with two truths. And I will say two truths that seemingly feel like they're not supposed to be alive at the same time. These two things can actually don't, they contradict one another. And how do we help families create space and children create space to say, you don't have to feel one or the other. You can actually feel both, right? So it might sound like I hate my dad's disease and the way he was, but I love my dad, right? And I still love my dad. I'm angry at everything that happened and I still miss him. I'm relieved. You know, I finally feel safe. And I'm also sad. I'm scared. And I know that every day that I try and do something, that I'm also being brave, the best that I can be. I'm resentful for what I went through and grateful. They don't have to live in either camp. These two, there's space to hold that dialectical thinking. And what that actually does, it creates that flexible mindset, that the belief that things can change. So there's a great book for little kids called Bubblegum Brain, Brick Brain. And so my daughter will tell me when my brain is doing one or the other. I love it. But what a bubblegum brain is saying, the flexible mindset, where I'm not where I want to be yet, but with time, things can change. I can get there. This is uncomfortable, but I'm going to try and share. Whereas the brick brain believes that things are permanent, right? This is language you can use with kids, right? Flexible mindset and flexible, that's sometimes too much for kids. But brick versus bubblegum, there's a visual there. But the brick is the belief that it will never change, it will never get better. I'm not good, assigning it to themselves, right? Or I'll never be the same without my dad, which might be true, but, and it'll always be this hard, right? So helping them build that adaptable, flexible mindset, particularly when they've had a series of survival roles, living by the rules of survival, and that ambiguous loss and potential other trauma and adverse childhood experiences. But how do we do that? Take an opportunity to listen before redirecting, right? Fully listen. What is happening before I offer any type of solution or redirection that can happen, right? Challenge the belief with open-ended questions. Again, saying don't feel that way rarely actually stops anyone from feeling that way, but it might be more of an exploration process. I'm wondering what makes you feel it won't change. Now you have the opportunity for them to tell you a story about where they might have evidence or ideas of why it won't change. Okay. Well, I'm wondering if it's ever been like that, something has ever felt this hard and it has changed. Okay. Encourage storytelling about times that they have solved problems and highlight those areas where they actually showed that they had agency and that they had options. And then as either a caregiver or a practitioner, how are you providing those options within your session and time with these kiddos? So as we go into this, I want to go over the intersectionalities of these two areas, right? And so if we talked about treatment and recovery for families impacted by substance use disorder and grief support, the reason this is so important is they actually overlap in care so much, right? So how are we informing one another where maybe they're looking for more support in that's more recovery leaned or grief support leaned, but to know that they actually share similar models. I recognize this when I went from working in hospice and then worked at the Betty Ford. All of a sudden, we were talking about all of these loss process. And while we were no longer talking about death and we were talking about their person in recovery, I was leaning into the same things and facilitations as the other camp. And so, how can we integrate these so much more? And so, and these are the four areas, right? Peer support, it's a strength-based approach. It leans into community support, and there's an ongoing process with a need for resources. So as we look at recovering communities and grief support for peer support, both lean into the idea of recognizing we need to have the shared experience, leaning into peer-based programming, right? For adults, that looks like AA, Al-Anon, treatment and recovery, family programs, faith-based groups. For children, they have the same, right? Alateen, Alatot. There's virtual programming for kids, as well as camps. Luna Network, who is in our directory, has Metaposa Camp that talks specifically around children who've been impacted by a substance use disorder. A substance use really is someone who's trapped by drugs and alcohol. In grief care, they similarly have similar areas where grief groups, virtual communities, meetups, faith-based. For children, it could be grief groups, school groups, and camps. Do you see how these are very similar? And sometimes there's an integration of both, where sometimes they have special groups that are for people who have had a stigmatized loss, so that it can feel that their stories don't feel as different from others in the group. That's a case by case basis. Some children don't want to be in that group because they feel additionally othered. Some children feel like that's a great place because they'll know that people get it. That's an opportunity to lean in and ask more questions from curiosity to see what would be a better fit. The strength-based approach. So both of these lean into a strength-based approach where it leans into positive psychology, resiliency theory. It's what they practice in the protective factors of ACEs. But what this does is promote self-efficacy and the personal agency around their choices, around the things that they can do. And so it changes from person to person. And if we do that, it recognizes unique strengths and it validates the personal experience. It leans into that idea of finding meaning is a personal process. So it respects the individual. And we see that in the recovery community as well as in grief care. Something that I like to share is this book. It's from a woman on Australia. It's the Resilience Donut. And so this is a really simple, easy way for educators or families at home. These are basically the practices of what you can do to help build the skills, the things that you need to navigate challenges and adversity. So one is for children and teens, the other one is for adults. So in children and teens, what they are basically saying here is of these seven areas, parent factor, skill factor, family and identity factor, education factor, peer, community, and money, if children can at least identify and feel confident in at least three of these areas, they have exponentially increased their ability to navigate adversity. Same as adults. So what I do is I actually get the squishy donuts, the stress ball donuts, and a Sharpie, and we'll go through these. And if we can think of things that we can add to our donut, we write them on. It might be, oh, my person is my grandfather. I can always go to him. And I am so good at math that I'm going to put that in there. And I know that I am really good at playing soccer. Okay, we have the three things. And then if there is a gap, we have an opportunity to figure out where to build. So this is a book, it's online. You can also see it here. I believe sometimes the resources are printable, but it's a really easy read book for families. And then community support. So what does that look like as far as what we do? We notice that both areas deal with stigmatic beliefs or misconceptions that are not culturally necessarily informed. And so what can we do to promote both require education, advocacy, and awareness. They both lean into recognizing and honoring special dates. We see how they are elevated by bringing awareness through national days, months of awareness, days of awareness, benefits, walks. But what this all does is it increases accessibility to resources and support and decreases stigma. So they follow a lot of these same models in order to inform the general public, right? If we think that public health model we looked at the other day, we're trying to fix zero and one so it takes off the pressure off of two and three. And then both to recognize this is where it was interesting to see when I worked at Betty Ford coming from grief that both of them honor a lifelong process. We recognize that in that family mobile, every person is impacted differently. There is a no one size fits all process in recovery or in grief care. Change needs change over time. They both seek meaning or that process afterwards as they retell their story. And both are taboo, both are pushed to the sides of our conversation. It's impacted even more by stigmatic loss, by substance use related loss. But we can already see that people don't like to talk about grief and loss. And so, how does this impact it even further? All right, we are going to break and then we're going to come back and jump right into an activity. And so we'll come back. Can we do an odd number? Like, actually, can we do 6 minutes? Does that sound okay? So we'll come back at 2:10. Okay, see you then.